Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another live edition of the Anomaly Academy with the Anomaly Archives Patreon program. Today's lecture is researcher Joe Green on a fascinating topic dealing with conspiracy, parapolitics, deep politics, whatever you want to call it, hidden history. Joe is somebody whose work I've been following for at least the last 5 or more years. Since becoming aware of his work. He is a fellow Texan, and I've really enjoyed the discovery of all his creativity and his very academically oriented approach to this often speculative, but when you get to the meat of it all, the deep reality of the histories that so often are controlled by the victors, as the saying goes. Joe Green is a parapolitical researcher who was affiliated with the Coalition on Political Assassinations, COPA, C-O-P-A, from 2005 to 2014, when it ended due to John Judge's death. John Judge was Joe's mentor and deeply influenced his work, as did Judge's mentors Mae Brussell and Penn Jones. Joe's work has appeared in Jim DiEugenio's KennedysandKing site, formerly Probe Magazine, CTKA, many times, in Ken Thomas's Steamshovel Press, and Russ Baker's WhoWhatWhy, Op-Ed News, the San Antonio Current, Out in San Antonio Magazine, Garrison Magazine, Deep Truth Journal, and various other outlets. You can find out more about him at his websites, joegreenjfk.com, saysomethingrealpress.com, and hiddenhistorycenter.org. The Hidden History Center was founded after the passing of that mentor, John Judge, and is a collection of research and materials from John Judge's research collection. And Joe Green serves as one of the board members of that nonprofit, which again you can find out more about at hiddenhistorycenter.org. And without further ado, I will go ahead and bring Joe up. Hey, Joe, how are you tonight?
Good. How you doing, Smiles?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Very glad to have you here for this talk. As I've gotten to know you through your work, I have been fascinated to learn more and more the subject of conspiracy research and deep parapolitical thinking, and of course my favorite version of that phraseology, parapolitics, parapolitical research, as to be distinguished from what often people think of, sadly, when they hear the words conspiracy theory, because of, as some would assert, that that was a disinformation propaganda campaign perpetrated by the CIA many decades ago to discredit those who would question their authority. As I've come to know your work and know you through your work, I've also had the pleasure of getting to know you, and I look forward to that friendship continuing, and I'm really curious to hear more from you tonight on this subject. And thank all our viewers for stopping in tonight, and for those that will be watching the replay in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. Let's see, I'll just go ahead and bring up your presentation, and we'll go ahead and get started here, and I'll let you take it away, and we'll be here if you need us, and I'm going to be watching intently. So
okay, thanks a lot, Smiles. I appreciate it. We ran a little late. That's my fault. We had some technical difficulties, or rather I had some technical difficulties. I do want to say I appreciate anybody who is listening to me on a Saturday night rather than doing something out and about in the world, and for supporting Anomaly Archives. I think what Smiles is doing is terrific. I have a natural affinity for anyone who is an archivist and is trying to preserve information in a world that doesn't have enough of it. So all good for Anomaly Archives, and I appreciate you guys listening. So I'm going to skip here. So this is kind of a general agenda of what I'm doing here. I'm going to tell you where I'm coming from. I got some thoughts about thinking and biases, the history of conspiracy in America, with which has been a topic that I've been very interested in, that I produced a lot of zines about, and then kind of going forward. The title of this presentation comes from an essay that appeared in my first book, Dissenting Views, and it's a little bit, it's not quite as detailed. I did a full presentation of like what a conspiracy theory looks like, and how to determine when a conspiratorial event is happening and things like that. I'm not going to get too far into that. My major concern these days, of course, has to do with the fact that the state seems to be using certain events to go after quote unquote conspiracy theories, conspiratorial thinking, because it has a vested interest in preventing that kind of thinking, because it wants us to all think the same thing, which is to say what the state thinks. And I've presented this metaphor before. It's a little bit like you've got a guy with a bloody knife and bodies everywhere, and he's saying, like, don't pay attention to what you see, pay attention to what I say. And I'm saying I had nothing to do with any of this. So the state has a natural tendency to say that what I'm saying, or what any of y'all are interested in or saying, is ridiculous and is completely off the table. And specifically that it's out of the temple, that you are speaking forbidden words because the state doesn't like it. In fact, I've defined conspiracy theory as just political analysis that the state doesn't like, regardless of what that state is. But of course, I'm concerned with the United States because I live here. And we've just recently had an election, and conspiracy theory has been a big part of all of this, which I'll get to in a minute, which was predicted by a mutual friend of mine and Smiles. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about, where I come from. That's an image of John Judge. That is at the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. We were in Dallas that weekend. It was an icy weekend. It wasn't good for John. It was very difficult for him to walk in that. It was like sleeting when he was trying to talk outside. It's crazy. But John was a fearless attacker of all things establishment, I would say. He used to do things like educating high school students. So, for example, the military would come to a high school and they'd have the military recruiters set up a little table and try to get kids to sign up. And John would get a desk next to those guys and explain why they shouldn't, and to tell them the things that the military recruiters wouldn't tell them about the downsides of being in the military, which is, of course, that you're going to be traveling the world killing people on behalf of the state for causes that you may not actually support. You just have to look at the history of America in the 20th century and now the 21st century to see how true that is. And one of the primary things that I learned from John, and one of the things that I've talked about, and I will be talking about in this presentation, is that a lot of people get into research because of the Kennedy assassination, and they stick only to the Kennedy assassination. And I think this is a problem because it leads sometimes people to believe things about the Kennedy assassination that are not true. And the reason that they're not true is because they don't know about all these other cases. And you have to look at it holistically as part of an alternate history in order to understand how they connect with one another and why certain things cannot be true about the Kennedy. Like, for example, that the mob did it, right? The mob murdered John F. Kennedy. If you only study the Kennedy assassination and you only look at the evidence that points to the mob, you can come to that conclusion. But if you pull the microscope up, you take a broader view, it becomes clear that the mob couldn't have done it, even though they may well have been involved. And it seems like, elements of the mob probably were. But they're not the prime mover, because what you're lacking is a political motive and a political will to cover all this up for the last 60 years. So John taught me that. And he taught me that the to look into the details of almost everything, because almost always any major event, whatever's on the newspaper, has some true items in it, but the overall point of view is untrue. So we'll look at some examples of that later. I wanted to start out too with some of the other major thinkers that I've been influenced by. That is John Judge's book, Judge for Yourself, which I was able to publish at depth, and like 100% of the proceeds from anyone who purchased that book goes to the Hidden History Center, where I serve on the board of directors. And which is all to the good. We've got a little space out in York, Pennsylvania that we're trying to maintain. So that's anything that can help that is to the good. So John Judge being the major one. John Judge, of course, was deeply influenced by his mentor, Mae Brussell, who continues to be completely underrated and understudied. Because Mae Brussell not only understood the events that were happening in her own time, she also understood what was going to happen. And she could do this just by reading the newspaper, because remember, there's no internet for Mae Brussell. She's just reading the newspapers and magazines and knowing who to look for and what they're doing. One of my favorite anecdotes about Mae is that more than a year prior to Jonestown exploding in 1978, there is a show you can find in 1977 where Mae Brussell says that the CIA is training people to be assassins in Ghana. And she says this purely based on the fact that Jim Jones is down there. And because a CIA guy bought the land that Jonestown was built on. But that's another story. But Mae was able to just look at these things and predict what was going to happen and understand exactly what was happening at any given time. I would recommend worldwatchers.info for Mae Brussell's material. You can find her shows on there. A lot of stuff that appeared in magazines like The Realist. Paul Krasner was the first person to publish Mae Brussell in The Realist. And her essays are available on that site. It was built by a friend of mine named Rob Filotico, who sadly is no longer with us. Ken Thomas, of course. Ken Thomas, brilliant, has had his foot, just recently passed away, had his foot in both realms, in the kind of smiles area of things in ufology, and also in the Kennedy assassination. And brilliant researcher, terrific guy. I liked him a whole lot. And I was able to write the afterword for a book of his that still remains relevant, especially because of the result of the election. Sherman Skolnick, unfortunately, I never got to know Sherman Skolnick, but his stuff is on the web and very easy to find. And he was another researcher who was involved in everything. So you can find information about, of course, the Kennedy assassination and other things, but also about the OJ case. Like, I understood what happened in the OJ case largely because of Sherman's work that pointed me in the direction to look at in the OJ case. And his stuff remains, terrific stuff. And I always point people to it. And the last guy is Robert Cutler, R.B. Cutler, who's probably a much more obscure figure. But he was a fascinating character. I almost want to write a book about this guy. And I never met Cutler either. Cutler was a guy who was a draftsman, and he did these brilliant drawings of the Kennedy assassination, of all manner of stuff, the Bobby Kennedy assassination. And they're brilliant just as artwork. But they're also fascinating. His insights in the case were fantastic. And he also did some things that were kind of charming, like writing to the FBI to, warn them about certain things, which of course he got semi-polite responses. Obviously the FBI was going to listen to Robert Cutler, right? But a fascinating guy. He did appear on Mae Brussell's show a few times, talking about the Ted Kennedy Chappaquiddick incident, which I'll also talk about in a little bit. And these are just some of the things that they're related. So the Mae Brussel, the Essential Mae Brussel, which is excellent, that Feral House put out, Adam Parfrey's publishing house, has Alex Constantine was heavily involved in that, and Paul Krasner. And so great stuff there. Robert Cutler, this is the one of the books he would hand make his books, so they're almost impossible to find. This is the problem with Cutler. And it just so happens that I got lucky because the Baylor Library in Waco, Texas, not too far from me, has a whole bunch of them. I only own 2 things that Cutler actually wrote because they're so limited. There's a book that Sherman Skolnick did called Ahead of the Parade, which is still available and out there to be bought. I would recommend it. And then Trumpocalypse Now at the end of that, which completely predicted everything that went into what was going to be a Trump presidency. So that book remains very relevant now, of course. And he said that Trump was at the center of the conspiratorial world and that he was bringing the conspiracy with him when he became president. So it's very, very fascinating stuff there. So this gets us to our kind of our main, the meat of what I wanted to talk about how we think about things. So there's a lot of kind of rumblings in the media. There has been for a number of years about conspiracy theorists. And what they've been trying to do for several years now is to equate conspiracy theorists with like violent ideologues, like guys with guns who want to shoot people. And if you have been to any sort of quote unquote conspiracy theory conference, whether it has to do with UFOs or anything else, these are guys who like to read books and go to the library. These are not fundamentally violent people, but they like to connect those things because what they're trying to do is make it crime think, basically. And in fact, most of this presentation could be summed up by the single word crime think if we were living in 1984, which we continue to get closer and closer to. The weird thing is that the internet was the thing that started people looking into a lot of this stuff because all of a sudden you could see it. It was easy to get to. You didn't have to go to, a Lumpanix catalog or, go to various libraries. And someone up there has realized that this is a bad thing that people are starting to think. And so we have to put a stop to that. And of course, there are problems with certain types of conspiracy theories, but we'll talk about those in a second here. Pictured here on the next few slides is my last book, which came out 2022, called Tinfoil Hat Not Included. It's basically about what this presentation is about. It's about the uses of language and the illogic of what is presented to us in the media when they're not just outright lying. So I see also on the internet, if you look at the spaces where people sort of argue about things, it's often said, well, you're biased, in some way, and you're biased in some way. And it's used like you've just invalidated everything that person said. The fact of the matter is that we all have biases. We also have we share certain biases among us. And some of those biases are like that we don't think about is a bias towards the present. In other words, every single one of us has a bias toward our own experience of the world at this time. And you can see this in sports. All of virtually sports, talk radio and that sort of, and magazines and stuff like that has to do with whether a given player in a given sport at this time is the greatest of all time. Yeah. How does this running back compare to Jim Brown? How does a particular quarterback stand with compared to Roger Staubach or Joe Montana or whatever the case may be, because you're always thinking about the present time and your own experience, and you're saying, I am seeing the best of this. We think that about almost everything. We are always biased towards our immediate present experience. And it's always going to be more real to us than anything that has happened in the past. So you got to think about that too when you're talking about this stuff. But just to say that somebody has a particular bias one way or another doesn't end the conversation. You can think about it as it's a point. Yeah. But it's a point like a point in a basketball game. It's not a point that just renders all other points irrelevant. So bias is not an immediate thing. Everybody has a bias. Now, the question becomes whether a particular person has a systemic bias. And you can see this in the media. Does the media always portray conspiracy theories as kind of negative or stupid? Yeah, they do, almost universally, and every type of media. So maybe that tells you more than just saying that one or another person is biased in one direction or another. You're looking for systemic biases, not individual, bias one way or the other, right? No. And this is important too. This here, when you're comparing something that happened now towards something that happened in the past, sometimes that analogy is valid, and sometimes it ain't. So again, it's any analogy is as good as the items that are being compared. So it's not simply say, well, this is like this other thing, because maybe it is, but maybe there are ways when it's not like this other thing. The upshot of this, and this is not a message that makes me very popular, is that all this stuff is complicated. And you can't just go, oh, because of this. It's almost never like that. It's always like the accumulation of evidence that's pointing to you a direction in one way or the other. It's not simply 2 + 2 = 4, right? So that's what I'm going to say. Now, meanings in discourse, right? So terms get redefined by the state. So the most famous one, probably with JFK researchers, is the term conspiracy theory, which is often said to have been invented by the CIA. It's not exactly correct, but they did invent the modern use of the term conspiracy theory back in, I think it was 65 or 66. There's a CIA memo mentions Mark Lane by name. And they're saying that these guys are conspiracy theorists. What's funny about that is if you unpack the words, right, conspiracy theorist, a theory is actually a well-accepted scientific fact, or not quite a fact, but it's something that everybody takes to be true in the absence of other evidence, right? The theory of evolution, right? Quantum theory. These are things that people work with every day and take to be true until they disprove it. So conspiracy theory is actually a pretty strong statement. What they probably meant was conspiracy hypothesis. But of course, that's not as catchy as conspiracy theory. But the idea is to tar everything with this statement and to make conspiracy theory a kind of, you're not invited to the party anymore because you're a conspiracy theorist. The funny thing about it, of course, is that as a practical matter, conspiracy theorists have not invented their own logic, right? They have not invented their own empiricism. They're using the same tools as anybody else. They're coming to different conclusions because they're finding different evidence. That doesn't make them crazy. And these standards, by the way, are not applied in any other scientific endeavor, right? If you have somebody who is a Big Bang theorist and then you got, 5% of physicists are steady state theorists, they may be called cranks, but they're not called conspiracy theorists and said to be insane and dangerous, right? There's not a danger associated with being a steady state theorist. And that should be true with anybody who does this kind of work. So what's the difference? The difference is that the state has a position on it. The state may or may not care about quantum theory, but it cares a lot about conspiracy theory because it implies that the government is doing things to us, which, we don't like very much. So the example I used here was about westward expansion, right? And that has to do with perspective. So westward expansion is, of course, a great American achievement. But that American achievement is associated with the mass murder and imprisonment of the indigenous people who were already on this piece of land, before the Pilgrims arrived. And that mentality, that point of view, also colors other things. Like, I live in San Antonio, so we have the Alamo. The Alamo is a big tourist attraction. But when you think about it, the story of Santa Anna destroying Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie and all those the heroes of the Republic of Texas and of the United States later. We took the land from them first, right? I mean, they're on Mexican land. The United States slowly encroached and then rapidly encroached into land that had been settled by Mexico. So the funny thing about that is we've got these heroic guys who survived a few days attack by Santa Anna and his troops. But actually they were holding a piece of land that wasn't theirs to begin with. I'm not saying that we should give it back or any of this stuff. We don't need to necessarily get into any of that now, but we should recognize that the story that we're being told is a story that is being told. That's all it is. It's a story. And it comes from a certain point of view, a certain perspective. And we are brainwashed into that perspective as children because we learn the story, right? The heroes of the Alamo, Davy Crockett and all that. That's how I learned the story when I was a kid in Texas history. And of course, watching Fess Parker swinging his rifle at the end of the last episode of Davy Crockett. And those images stay with you because you learn them as a child. And you say that those are facts, but in fact, they are stories. So, and some people get very upset when you present this material the way I'm presenting it now. They don't like it because it touches on something that is very dear to them that they learned as a child. So you have to remember that too. So the biases can be revealed by simple thought experiments. And this is something that I would tell people. It was the 10-year anniversary of the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in August. And of course, that resulted in protests and violence that was heard around the world. The United States became a major story in foreign presses because of this. And what would we have thought if the Iranian government had decided that they had interests in Ferguson, Missouri, and sent over a few thousand troops to keep the peace? How would we have reacted to that? Would we have thought that's insane? Like, what is Iran thinking? What possible interests could they have in Ferguson, Missouri? And yet, since World War II, the United States has been the world's cop, where we routinely have interests in other places and we send troops in to do our bidding. Even when it's totally preposterous, right? The U.S. invaded Grenada because they elected a slightly socialist government. Grenada at the time had less than 100,000 people on it. I don't know how much they have now, but it's probably not that much more than that. So 100,000 people in toto. And we sent the U.S. Army to go deal with them because they had a slightly left-leaning government. If that sounds insane, it is. Where did we get the authority to do that from? Ding, from ourselves. We decided that we could do that. And we decided that we could invade a whole lot of other places for that same thing. It's like, well, we're the world's cop. This is what we're going to do. We have interests in Vietnam, so we're going to go into Vietnam, right? And this happens over and over and over again. So, very important, and a thing that I spent a lot of time with in this book. The state is not neutral. It's often presented that way. Or even worse, accepted that the state has a position that is superior to other thinkers. If you watch the news, they're interviewing somebody from the State Department, and the reporters are not challenging anything that the State Department actually says about whatever country we happen to be invading on that day. It's not patriotic to do so. But we can't just simply accept that the state is giving us good information all the time, because we know from the historical record that in so many places that the state has lied to us numerous times. We know this. So it is absurd to treat every future statement coming from the state as obviously true, because it's not. It's like any other statement. It doesn't have more authority than any other person's statement, right? So if you read the papers, you will notice that saying that Vladimir Putin is a ruthless gangster who kills his political opponents all the time and is operating a gigantic conspiracy within his own country, that is not a conspiracy theory. That is something that we can discuss all day and all night and take it seriously. If we said anything like that about any sitting president, possibly with the exception of Donald Trump, no, but even so, it would not be at the same level. That's conspiracy theory, right? Because it has to do with our president, not their president. Their president does all kinds of bad stuff. Ours doesn't. And I talk a little bit about, and this is almost an aside here. So Ronald Reagan and John Judge did brilliant work on this, and you can still find it on YouTube, the speeches he gave about this. Ronald Reagan was shot by a man who had significant close personal ties to George Bush. In fact, they were family friends. John Hinckley, the Hinckley family, they were an oil family, and they had known each other. And in fact, John Hinckley, his brother was scheduled to have dinner with George Bush's brother, like 2 nights after the assassination attempt. Pointing this out as a conspiracy theory. This is not something that you're supposed to talk about, right? And then I just pointed out that one of the doctors who was brought in to testify in the trial of Hinckley, he had also testified in the Mark David Chapman shooting of John Lennon. Klein was a CIA doctor and was connected to MKUltra, and later he was charged with perjury for lying about his credentials. So why would the defense bring this guy up to testify in the case? In both of those cases, why would they do that? Well, there's significant evidence that both Hinckley and Mark David Chapman had been MKUltraized or otherwise used as a kind of sleeper agent. There's many parallels between what they did and even what they did afterwards, after the shooting. So these are the kinds of things we need to look at. There's a new book on the Lennon shooting by David Whelan. Very interesting stuff there. But we have to look at this stuff and track the people that are involved, because we'll find all sorts of interesting things. Oh, and this is just I'm sorry about how that looks. That didn't come out right. But this is an article that mentions Chapman's lawyer and getting Dr. Milton Klein to be a psychologist and an expert on hypnotism to testify on Chapman's behalf. But all of Chapman's background is against that. He's working for the government. And he also lied about his credentials. This was something that I found very interesting. This was back in 2017 or 2018, I think. 2017. Yeah. So they're working on exactly the stuff that the Jolly West and all those guys that are associated with MKUltra were trying to do. Flipping a switch inside the head. With new technology, scientists are able to exert wireless control over brain cells of mice with just the push of a button. The first thing they did was make the mice hungry. So, and you look at this, and this is the Rockefeller Foundation that is supporting this research. So, yeah, this stuff continues. It did not go away when, Richard Helms threw away most of the documents related to MK Ultra, and then was celebrated by the CIA for doing so. This research continued. It did not stop, and it continues to this day. And God knows where they're at now, because they were pretty sophisticated 60 years ago, but they're only getting better at this sort of thing. Okay, here's another thing that I will often see in conversation. When two people are arguing, they will equate the left and the right. Of course, these days, there's a tendency to demonize the left for some reasons that the left, frankly, has been dumb about. But we all know that there is a general trend among the youngest of us to be sort of right-wing lately, which is very bizarre. Generally speaking, people tend to start out as kind of liberal, and then they will get more conservative as they get older, as they get more and more invested in the system. They naturally do not want change. I was talking to my nephew a long time ago when he was a small kid, and I told him that, he said, like, what's the difference between liberals and conservatives? I said, well, you got two monkeys. One monkey climbs on top of the other monkey. The monkey on top is the conservative, and the monkey at the bottom is the liberal. That's an easy way to think of it, right? But what they are not is equally bad. So right now, in this country, because our country's demented in so many ways, the left liberal sphere is consumed by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, institutionally, is basically like center right compared to the rest of the world. And the right, of course, is just, crazily to the right, sort of Ayn Rand. So institutionally, yes, the DNC does have a certain equivalency, because they're not really in the game to help anybody. They're in the game to increase its coffers. So, in fact, there are lots and lots of people within the Democratic political organization who are not so unhappy about Trump being in charge, because it makes it very easy to fundraise when you have this big demon, regardless of the fact that Trump is going to be electing 4 more years worth of Supreme Court justices, and then all the other justices, the appellate courts, all that stuff is going to go to the right. Of course, he's nominating insane people like Matt Gaetz to his cabinet. All of these things are detrimental to all of us, like not just left liberals, but to every person, except for this tiny elite that wants to keep everybody under control. So, but in here I say, since World War II, the United States has had the habit of invading countries, assassinating foreign leaders, and overthrowing governments. These all have something in common. The governments attacked by the U.S. were on the left, socialist, proto-communist, whatever you want to call them. When you look through the records of the CIA files, you will not find a cable by anyone saying that the U.S. should, for example, hire Che Guevara. They don't say, "Oh, we've got Che Guevara. Let's bring him in." No, they executed him, right? And yet, at the end of World War II, when the Nazi army was defeated, the United States brought some of its top leaders to run the space program and to a large degree foreign policy because of Reinhard Gehlen. Reinhard Gehlen had been a guy who had these stay-behind units inside Russia, where he was spying on the Soviet Union for Germany. And Reinhard Gehlen said, "I'll turn this over to you. I can help the United States, because your enemy is going to be the Soviet Union from here on out." And we took him up on that deal. And Allen Dulles said, we don't have to invite him to the club, which is to say that spying is a dirty business, and that sometimes you have to get in bed with these guys. But of course, they're only getting in bed with these guys who are super right wing and bringing them into the United States government. That does not happen with lefties, right? We don't bring them in. We don't have a conversation about that. And this is a good meme that I found. U.S. backed right wing military coups. This is only Latin America. So, like, Iran is not in here in 1953, right? When the United States overthrew Mohammed Mossadegh, in large part because of British oil interests. And Churchill, well, it's a long story, but we overthrew them essentially for the Brits. And because Mossadegh was not a strong leader, we wanted the Ayatollah to be in command. Why do we want the Ayatollah to be in command? Because he's easy to deal with. And because a radical fundamentalist Islamist won't make deals with the Soviet Union either. At least that's the thinking, right? So that was the whole point of Afghanistan. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was quite open about that in the 80s, when we essentially tricked or got the Soviet Union to go to have a ground war in Afghanistan, which Zbigniew Brzezinski said we gave them their Vietnam. And of course, Osama bin Laden emerges out of that, which is, again, another long story. But this is a fascinating thing. So we are overthrowing all these places in Latin America, and they are right-wing military coups. None of these do we come in on the side of the sort of liberal government and, we decide to give them a kind of democratic government. We're always supporting dictators. That's what we do. It's good for business. So this is a quote that I like to use. Thomas Kuhn wrote this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And Kuhn was the equivalent of a conspiracy theorist. Because what he was writing is that science isn't really science. Like, we know the theory of how science is supposed to progress, but in point of fact, science doesn't really progress that way in the real world because humans are going to human, right? Scientists do not convince each other of their ideas, right? I think it was it Niels Bohr who said that scientists never convince each other, they just die, and then new ones take up the ideas. But this is Thomas Kuhn. He says, scientific education makes use of no equivalent for the art museum of the Library of Classics. And the result is sometimes a drastic distortion in the scientist's perception of his discipline's past. He comes to see it as leading in a straight line to the discipline's present vantage. In short, he comes to see it as progress. So scientists are not very good historians, right? There's no historian of old ideas in science. And yet those ideas sometimes come back. Even ether is starting to come back in a very tiny way in physics. Because once you prove that an idea is wrong or unproductive, then you move on to what everybody agrees is the truth. But very often, in fact, at every point in scientific history, what everybody agrees is the truth turns out not to be the truth and gets thrown over by some other idea. So that paradigmatic thinking is a big problem, because it means that everybody has to agree on a given paradigm and work within that paradigm. And as a result of which, there are very few scientific revolutions. Generally speaking, when you study science, the academic scientist does not make the big revolutions. They do the sort of yeoman work. They make tiny work. They produce a paper that supports this thing or supports nothing, but it's within the vantage of the paradigm. The guys who throw over, that create scientific revolutions, tend to be patent clerks like Albert Einstein. It tends to come from guys who are mavericks who are not necessarily working in a university paradigm. It's almost as if it's designed not to have revolutions, to suppress large-scale changes and to suppress real progress for what is taken to be progress, if that makes sense. And result of this, I wanted to mention this real quick because they're both so much in the manosphere and in the discussions about flat Earth, right? Flat Earth became very popular, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. People started talking about flat Earth. And I had a friend of mine who said, God, a bunch of idiots. And I was like, well, so I'm philosophical about this stuff because I come from a study of philosophy. That was what I read when I was a kid. And when you study philosophy, you take things that somebody said and you kind of wear it like a hat for a while and you investigate it and you see if it makes sense or not, right? So Leibniz in the monadology said that the world, the universe, is consisted of tiny windowless monads, these little things that all operate like individual clocks that all tell the same time all the time, right? And he has reasons for saying this. So when flat Earth came around, I was like, okay, fine, flat Earth, whatever. Because it's just a new way of saying things, and that's either going to be a productive idea or an unproductive idea. But the thing that kind of amuses me about it is that flat Earth is considered the stupidest thing ever, while simulation theory is taken very seriously by scientists and discussed as if we're all living in a video game or whatever, a simulation. The strange thing about it to me is that flat Earth is essentially the same theory. His flat Earth says there's a creator, and that the world has been designed such that it has these characteristics, which in simulation theory, you would say the same thing, that it's been designed and it has these particular characteristics. But in fact, it doesn't matter, because if it's a simulation, then it doesn't really matter whether the Earth is flat or not. That becomes an artifice like everything else. So I don't know what the difference is. No, I don't know why you would get so upset about flat Earth theory, but not equally upset by simulation theory. Because there's a lot of things that are congruent to each other in those ideas. I happen to think, as a matter of course, that like multiverse is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. And this is everywhere. People talk about it. Scientists talk about it. They're suggesting that the multiverse is if you can't even account for the existence of one universe, it seems to me poor play to then invent an infinite number of other universes, right? Let's account for one first. Let's see if we can figure out the one. And then we can start to posit a bunch of other universes, which, by the way, we have no way of accessing, right? So it really is like the medieval monks talking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. That's how seriously I take the multiverse, right? So just things to think about. And part of the conspiracy theory part of it, I borrow this concept from my buddy Richard Bartholomew, who wrote The Deep State in the Heart of Texas, very good book, which I published through Say Something Real Cross. Richard said that a lot of the arguments about conspiracy theory are really not about conspiracy theory. They're about conspiracy fantasy. All right? So conspiracy fantasy is a lot of the stuff where, a guy says that that actors are also people in the government at the same time. That somehow this actor kind of looks like this other person in politics, so therefore they are the same person. Very bizarre. That's a conspiracy fantasy. David Icke talking about reptilians. What is the evidence for reptilians? Well, there's this glitchy video where this person, that's conspiracy fantasy. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying there's no evidence for it. So conspiracy theory has evidence. Conspiracy fantasy doesn't. It's just nonsense. And sometimes there's no distinction made, particularly because the media wants to equate the work of serious researchers with people who aren't serious researchers and are, making videos on YouTube. Right. The core difference between somebody who's espousing, that John F. Kennedy Jr. is still alive and is helping QAnon, and the work of, like, say, Peter Dale Scott, there's no relation to one another. Right. It's like saying a fantasy novelist is the same thing as a, professor. It's not the same thing. Can be the same thing, not the same thing generally. Conspiracy theory is a hard no with respect to conspiracy fantasy. And if you notice, the media tends to put those terms together. They treat conspiracy theory as conspiracy fantasy. So that just to say the word conspiracy theory means that you're out of there. You're out of the temple. You're a nut. And that comes to the case of a lot of individual cases, because one thing to understand is that conspiracy theories are made. They are not born. And that's another thing that often is not well understood in the media, right? Nobody starts out thinking that, Lee Harvey Oswald didn't kill John F. Kennedy, right? Well, why don't we? Well, because we're taught that Oswald did it. And everybody understands that, of course, Oswald did it. In order to go against that idea, you have to have some study. You have to say, oh, I'm going to read a book about this, and then start to notice, hey, this stuff doesn't make sense, right? Some of this doesn't make sense. So if Oswald really did it, then why and this and this and this other thing? They give you a quick example of CE-399. CE-399 is the magic bullet. And the reason it's called the magic bullet is because you can see it right there, what it looks like. And yet, allegedly, it went through JFK, through Connolly, broke his wrist, and ended up in his thigh. That seems unlikely that a bullet could do that, right? Not even a high-velocity bullet at that, because it's coming out of allegedly, the Mannlicher Carcano. So there are facts that if you're looking at it, this would draw you up short. You say, huh. And also, the provenance of the bullet is crazy, because it's discovered on a stretcher. Although there's been some controversy about that with the last year. There was some new evidence about that. It wasn't really new and it wasn't really evidence, but that's a whole other story. But the trajectory of the bullet is highly questionable. And the guy who invented the single bullet theory, otherwise known as the magic bullet theory, was Arlen Specter, who's not a ballistics expert. Right? He came up with a theory that the Warren Commission liked, but he had no expertise whatsoever in creating it. And it's obvious that he didn't, because, again, look at the bullet, right? How did the bullet do all this stuff? And it looks like you bought it today from the store. These things don't make sense, right? And like I say, it'd be one thing if you were taught in school that, maybe this happened and maybe this happened, but it's not presented that way. If it's taught at all, it's presented as an obvious fact that Oswald did this thing, right? So this is just the beginning of the horde of impossibilities related to the Kennedy assassination. And one thing, another accusation that you can level at the media is that they always go back to the Warren Commission. They always say the Warren Commission ruled this thing. But the funny thing about that is that the actual last investigation, as Gate and Fonzie called it, was a House Select Committee on Assassinations, which issued a report in 1979 that concluded that President Kennedy was murdered in a probable conspiracy. So why is that not the last word? Right? If you were just looking at it, completely uninvolved in the case, you would say, well, the last thing that the government actually said is that it was a probable conspiracy. But they never say that. They go back to the Warren Commission and they treat anybody who says differently as a nut, including people like Oliver Stone. But why is it insane to suggest that there are conspiracy theories when the United States' own report says that there was one? right? There's an inconsistency in how they're evaluating this stuff. MLK, a lot of the same problems with that assassination. The assassin could not have done the shooting. There are problems with the ballistics and the murder weapon. And the assassin has resources that are state-sponsored. James O'Reilly, the accused assassin, got away after first dumping all of this personal stuff right where the shooting happened. He goes and dumps his rifle and his prison radio and his clothes, his underwear. Like, why does he do this? And then takes off, and he's eventually arrested by Scotland Yard. How the heck does that happen? And before that, he had gone to Canada and got several IDs that all look like him, are age appropriate. And they all are related to the certain business out there, but we're not going to get into that. But there's all this stuff that points away from the accused assassin. So it's the same pattern. So, and I did not include Malcolm X on this, but Malcolm X, there's a whole bunch of stuff there too. RFK assassination. These are zines that I've written for Microcosm Publishing. I mentioned that so that, Microcosm Publishing doesn't punch me in the face. But the RFK assassination is the easiest one in some fashion because Sirhan, as noted by a ton of witnesses, was standing between 3 to 8 feet in front of Bobby Kennedy. So if Sirhan had shot Bobby Kennedy, the wounds would be in his chest, right? Or his face, or maybe his lower body, depending on, although in point of fact, he only got one shot off before the maitre d' that was standing next to him grabbed his wrist and started slamming the wrist on the table as he was firing. So he's not even aiming at that point. But the bullet that kills Bobby Kennedy is at the back of his head at contact range. Well, Sirhan was never back there, so he cannot be the assassin. And yet everybody knows that Sirhan killed Bobby Kennedy. And in fact, Sirhan is still in jail. Right? And that's just scratching the surface. There's a whole bunch of other things. And I've done numerous interviews about all these different topics individually, which you can find on YouTube and elsewhere on various podcasts. But Sirhan clearly, it is impossible that Sirhan shot Bobby Kennedy. Could not have happened. And yet everybody says contrary. How does that happen? And then I go into some of these other deep events. Jonestown, which I first heard about, and that's how I discovered John Judge, is he wrote an article for a book called Secret and Suppressed that was published by Adam Parfrey about Jonestown and why everything that everybody knows about Jonestown is completely wrong. And so when I came to write my own zine, I started with John, but then I went into the history of Ghana because it turns out that particular area is extremely rich in all sorts of stuff, including like gold, but also other minerals. And people have been trying to exploit that for like 400 years, beginning with the Dutch. And there's some very fascinating things about Ghana, even to this day, that have to do with that history. And then I wrote about Chappaquiddick, which I view as an attempted assassination, which most people do not. And I place it in a series of attempted assassinations against Ted Kennedy that most people are unfamiliar with. And everyone knows that, Ted was trying to bang this girl and, he drove her in and drowned this poor lady. That is not what happened. And you find that out by looking into some of these details. And you also notice, and that was the other thing that John told me, is that you would find people that pop up like a bad penny in all these cases. And in this case, it's E. Howard Hunt. And also Tony Alusevich, who is not a figure that most people know, but he was the bag man in the Watergate scandal. When Hunt was in jail and got a message to Richard Nixon that he needed $1 million or he was going to blow the lid on the whole Bay of Pigs thing. The guy who got Hunt the money was Tony Alasevich. And Tony Alasevich is one of the investigators on Jonestown. And that's just the beginning of that story. But it's really fascinating, the stuff that was going on with Chappaquiddick and what was actually happening in the background of the stuff. And then I include a zine that I did about the Black Panthers. I view the Black Panthers as very important because they were sort of the last attempt to build a community within the United States that was opposing the tendencies of the current government to invade other countries. And they were attempting to get solidarity with countries that were traditionally attacked by the United States, which was, by the way, the same thing that Malcolm X was doing in 1964, right up until the point he was murdered. He was going to other countries, countries that had been traditionally enemies of the United States, and coming in as a goodwill of peace. In fact, Nicholas Katzenbach tried to get him prosecuted under the Logan Act as if Malcolm X was acting as a real ambassador, which Malcolm was not. He was an ambassador for Malcolm X. He was not representing the interests of the United States, which was the real problem. So you find that there are these little connections that go between all these deep events, and that if you just scratch the surface, you immediately start to find some of the same players and some of the same connections, and they're right there to be found. And I mentioned the Symbionese Liberation Army and their kidnapping of the heiress, Patty Hearst, which Mae Brussel at the time had pointed to a pornographic novel that was written a year before that ever happened that told the story of the SLA kidnapping Patty Hearst and turning her into a revolutionary. Not using those terms. And then it turns out that Helsinki, the guy who was the head of the Symbionese Liberation Army, was at a prison called Vacaville in Northern California in the 50s at the same time as Charles Manson. And of course, Mae Brussel saw through the Charles Manson case right away. You know, I used to tell people all the time, Charles Manson is the most famous mass murderer who never actually murdered anyone. But again, that's just the beginning of that story. So, basically, I recommend looking into as much Mae Brussel as you can. And here I point to three what I think are excellent documentaries about particularly the Kennedy case. There are many other good documentaries about the other cases. The Searchers by Randy Benson, The Assassination of Mrs. Payne, which came out very recently by Max Good, who's a friend, and he's terrific. And then Jim DiEugenio's and Oliver Stone's JFK Revisited, which I thought was wonderful. It's a 4-hour documentary that kind of brings us up to date in the case. And there are many other. Ted Chirac's documentary on the Robert F. Kennedy assassination case was made, within a few years of the assassination, and it's wonderful. It has so much great information in it. Very well, and you can find it on YouTube. So, thank you very much for listening to me blather on about this stuff. That's the Conspiracy Fun Book and the holiday edition of the Conspiracy Fun Book, also published by Microcosm Publishing. If you're a teacher, I recommend these things. The Conspiracy Fun Book, there's for example, one thing is a word search where you're asked to find the killer of John F. Kennedy, and you can't find Oswald's name in the word search. So you have to pick some other names, such as Allen Dulles, which, getting back to Dulles, when the CIA overthrew Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, the guy who drew up the plans was Allen Dulles. So when the government starts murdering its own presidents and other political leaders, the same guy who drew up those plans is likely the person who drew up the plans to kill the leader of the state, because he'd done it before. He had the contacts. So, and just because Kennedy fired him from being head of the CIA doesn't mean that had any practical effect on the CIA, because what really happened is that the CIA moved into Allen Dulles' home, and he would still take meetings with all the CIA leaders at his house. which is amazing, in fact. So anyway, the point being that on all of these different cases, there are these signposts that tell you that you're on the right track. And they do not point to anything the media has to tell you about any of these cases. And I would expect increasingly that conspiracy research is going to be interfered with. Of course, it's already happened, but I think it's going to get worse. So that's one thing we have to watch and we have to be vigilant about. So I'm Joe Green. Joe Green JFK is my main website, but also I support the Hidden History Center, St. Southern Red Cross, and Microcosm Publishing. And also I would say the Center for Deep Political Research is another think tank that I belong to, with the filmmaker Randy Benson, who made The Searchers, and Richard Bartholomew as well. So I would encourage people to look that up as well. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Really enjoyed that. Folks, if you have questions or comments, you can leave them and we can either bring them up or I can read them aloud. There's obviously this deep politics is a very deep subject. There's so many directions to go in. One of the other works that you mentioned, I guess actually you didn't mention it in this presentation, but some of the movies, documentaries that you've been worked on. One of the more wild ones, as we talked privately recently, that is associated with a previous work, King Kill 33. Was it Dallas in Wonderland? Is that the?
So the story of that is that I was hired to be a research consultant and a script consultant to a movie called Dallas in Wonderland that had been based on a script that was originally written by Adam Parfrey. And so they sent me the script to read, and I said, holy cow, because I was like, first of all, it was brilliant. But second of all, Parfrey put all kinds of stuff like there. I was like, are we really going to get this made? And I was assured that we were green. We had a green light. We needed to get somebody to play the lead, but that's where we're at. And so I got hired to do that. The movie was about a documentarian who is paid and convinced to make a documentary about the Kennedy assassination, a topic he is not initially interested in. And so we had always said, it started out as a joke and then it became not a joke, that we were going to make that documentary. And so when you see the movie, you're going to see clips of real researchers from this documentary. So the idea is you'd hear John Judge talking about stuff, as he's making this documentary, which I thought was like the coolest idea ever. Like, yeah, let's do this. So we did make the documentary. So that's the King Kill 63 part of it. Because in the movie, oh God, what's his name? The King Kill 33, James
Shelby Downard.
Shelby Downard, yeah. Shelby Downard was a character in the movie.
Oh, okay.
And it was the best part in the movie.
Sure.
And Sir Ben Kingsley had agreed to play it.
Wow.
So we got Ben Kingsley for this picture. Yeah. So I was very excited that day, believe me. And he was into it, man. And a little bit disappointed to find out that he was a real person. And we there was a question of whether he was going to listen to the tape or not. But anyway, so we're making this thing and we finished the documentary, and then we're going to show the documentary at the Dallas Film Festival in 2015. And we got a call the night before we were going to show the documentary from the 6th Floor Museum, telling us that they owned every clip related to the Kennedy assassination. So the clips of Dan Rather and everything, they said, we own all that stuff. So you've got to pay us before you use any of it. And they told us not to show the film. And of course, Ryan and I, the director, was like, no, well, screw that. We're definitely showing it. So we closed the 2015 film festival with that film, and it got a great reaction. I answered questions about it for like 45 minutes afterward, and the only reason it ended is because they kicked us all out. So people, they dug the documentary. And then we got a communication from the 6th Floor Museum saying that the person they sent to watch the film liked it very much, and hoped that we would cut a deal with them to make sure that they got paid for all of their intellectual property, which was crazy. But what happened is that, and this is a long story, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the picture did not get made. So we had a pay-to-play contract with some actors, and we did not roll camera. So because we did not roll camera and they had pay-to-play contracts, that's an immediate debit to the budget of the film. So if anybody would distribute that film, there's like a $900,000 negative carry attached to it. Plus the money that the director and producers had spent making the documentary was a line item on the film's budget, which was, it started out somewhere at 20 million, 15, it was a small budget picture, but that documentary cost like $900,000 to make.
Wow.
So that's an additional negative carry to anybody who wants to distribute even the documentary. So that's the problem. So nobody has seen it.
That's really unfortunate. Well, I bring it up because it in so many ways the person at the center of that, y'all call it King Kill 63, obviously for obvious reasons, and of course the original work by James Shelby Downard, King Kill 33, is one of these bizarre seminal conspiratorial novels, fantasies. I mean, to me, it kind of seems like in some ways ground zero. I mean, obviously I'm no expert on this, and I'm sure there's other predecessors before, but for this idea of conspiracy fantasy that you were saying, Bartholomew has talked about, and you alluded to this, like there's for the last 20 or last 10 years, there's been this increasing wave. It's kind of subsided, but it coincided and melded, I think, with the quote unquote crisis actor idea, this idea of staged events.
Yep.
And but the worst version of which or the most mentally unstable version, I think of in terms of the idea of simulacra, spitting image or separated at birth thinking of like, oh, Morgan Freeman is Jimi Hendrix because they look alike. That's the kind of rational, quote unquote, thinking that these researchers do. And I think I've joked with you once about, I've publicly apologized for starting the Alex Jones is Bill Hicks conspiracy theory. It was a joke. It was just it's something my friends and I joked about, and yet it became this whole crazy huge thing that some wackos believe, and that even Texas Monthly Magazine ended up reporting on.
Yeah.
But with the James Shelby Downard stuff, there's so many elements there that have grown to inform a lot of the worst of conspiracy theorizing. Not least of which perhaps is, there's an understandable distrust of secret societies. Just the idea of anybody meeting in secret, it begs the question, what are they doing? It can't be for any good, even though most of the big ones that are still in existence would tell you, no, we are doing good. We are, a group of people elevating our brothers and sisters. And so like with the James Shelby Downer stuff, I don't know if that, obviously there's been waves of anti-Freemasonry, obviously, for before that, but it in some ways seems like it almost was the seed for the modern revival of that. I guess this is kind of leading me towards a question about what differences do you see between quote unquote left-leaning and right-leaning conspiracies and conspiracy research? Because obviously there are overlap, there. And yet, I think back to one of my high school teachers of saying, extreme right-wing politics and extreme left-wing politics are like a burrito. They overlap at the top or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they overlap in the areas of control is what I would say, is that there's the aspect of controlling people making them do this thing or making them think a certain way. Everybody has to agree on these tenets. And then, once we agree on that, everything will be fine. Lefties do that just as much as righties do. And when I say this, I also don't say that like right-wing theorists aren't wrong about everything they say, because it's turned out that actually in some areas, they've turned out to be right sometimes. Not the guy who says that Morgan Freeman is Jimi Hendrix. But there have been right-wing conspiracy guys who say some true stuff. I mean, it's not a bad thing to have somebody from that perspective in this field, because to me, it's like you progress, like it gives you more evidence on something that maybe you wouldn't have looked at. It does tend to end up in stuff like the Clinton body count and things like that. But that's not to say that everything they say is wrong. And I think specifically with Shelby Downard, so you got to remember, like I said, the script was written by Adam Parfrey. And Adam Parfrey was sort of, it's hard to call him right wing, but he was definitely in the individualist mode, right? He didn't care about society at all. He was always, his motto was no lives matter. Right. That was Adam, who by the way, I liked very much. And Adam was really nice to me, because during that whole process of making the film, Adam would call me every now and then. We'd have these long conversations, but mostly he was telling me what to be careful of and what to worry about being in Hollywood. A lot of that stuff he was right about too. So yeah, no, I think part of Shelby Downard's presence, and he ends up being the hero of the film at the end of it, in a strange way. He was having fun with this idea that he was partially a comic or satirical figure, because there was all kinds of Freemasonry stuff in that script, and deep Freemasonry, the Twin Pillars, where that leads to, Jabalon, all that stuff is in the script. And I was like, I don't know how we're getting this made, but okay. But the ultimate idea about it was not to say that, Shelby Downard is the person we should look to for answers.
Right.
But that he kind of becomes a hero almost in spite of himself at the end of this picture. It was a complex portrait, which I think you have to go with, because Shelby Downard was like pretty racist.
Yeah.
He had a lot of the kind of foibles of right wing. The way he talked about Martin Luther King was crazy. He called him like a dog and all this stuff. But he did say some other things that were pretty interesting and that were true. And so part of that demarcation, I think, is for researchers to do. I don't like that stuff to be presented in general to the media, because it tends to become a mess. And you don't want to equate this stuff. But you have to understand too, we're also making a movie. So it was not, a lot of this stuff is the logic tends to be symbolic. It's not that we're literally saying this or this other thing. It's take a look at this very interesting character and what he brings to the story in question.
I would say for anybody interested in that person, if they ever even existed, there's a lot of interesting explorations of, again, whether James Shelby Downard actually existed and or was it a construction of multiple authors. And there definitely seems to be multiple authors there, including Parfrey, I believe.
Yeah.
But as disturbing a character and a storyline as that man's alleged life is, the story of how his story came to the rest of us is itself fascinating. I love that you used the Kuhn quote. He's somebody obviously with dealing with anomalies and frontier fringe science topics, who comes up a lot, has always been inspiring in terms of this idea of trying to understand why the prevailing scientific authority is just like the state. Trust us. We're in charge. We know better. We know best. And why I think Charles Fort, after whom the phrase Fortean is coined, as somebody who was always questioning authority. And I remember the first time I read something from, I don't know if it was 100 years ago, but a long time ago, that was describing Forteans as like, oh, just rabble rousers. And conspiracists in the skeptical sense of questioning everything. But and you're evoking of flat Earth as compared to simulation theory, I find as an interesting line of thought. And it reminds me of a quote I love to go to that I believe was William Burroughs, who said something to the effect of, or no, not Burroughs. Burroughs, the Fear and Loathing author.
Hunter Thompson.
I guess it maybe, I'm not sure which. One of them,
Yeah.
one of those gonzo thinkers, said something to the effect of, if the United States military discovered that the world was flat, they would keep it a secret because they could use it to their military advantage. And we, that's the kind of thing though that we see, at least in the realm of conspiracy fringe anomalies thinking, whether it's the idea of suppressed free energy devices, which also connects to the idea of suppressed UFO UAP technology, this idea of the powers that be keeping hidden things from us that again could be used militarily, but also that would completely upset the paradigm. Some of the biggest names in the UFO field, reputable or not, have long pushed this idea that the reason that secret isn't unveiled is because it would upset the oil paradigm, that it would destroy the military industrial complexes of the world's grips on control of the rest of us and society. And in this idea of the suppression of a particular branch of physics or like the idea of electrogravitics, some kind of something that would make these ships rise, is a growing idea that's been growing for a long time. But that somehow the military industrial complex has suppressed and put into these special access programs. And anyway, that is all just to kind of show that there's so much overlap with conspiracy research. Folks, I did want to invite anyone listening right now to feel free to type your questions if you have any, or comments into the chat box. What more can you tell us about the Hidden History Center?
Yes, so the Hidden History Center came about because it was John Judge's dream, basically. He always wanted to have a hidden history center, and he had several ideas for it. One of his ideas was that you would have a center, and then you would make a game out of finding it. So you get a busload of kids and give them clues on where to find the hidden history center, and so they'd have to work. I don't know if that would actually work, because he wanted it to be in DC, and I don't know if you could just release a bunch of kids downtown to go find this place. Right. But it was a cool idea. But he always wanted to have, and he did want to have it in DC. The problem is that we could do that if we were Bill Gates, but it's just prohibitively expensive to put anything in DC. So right now it exists in York, Pennsylvania, and it stores all the files related to John Judge's stuff and all the stuff that's related to the HHC. But that was his dream, and Howard Zinn was one of the guys who endorsed it, which he was very excited about. And I think it's a great thing. We're doing our best, and this more than most people, how hard it is to maintain any kind of archive of anything. Yeah. And how expensive the proposition is, and trying to raise money for it and all that. I mean, it's not easy. And Marilyn does tremendous work. Marilyn was John's partner at the time of his death, and she is not a conspiracy theorist. She's a poet, and she just inherited all this stuff because she happened to find John Judge on a dating site, which I always think is Can you imagine joining a dating site and then being matched to John Judd?
Discovering that the love of your life is an amazing, deep parapolitical thinker. Yeah.
Yeah. Who knows everybody. And it was funny. But Mel has, I mean, she loved him, and she has taken on the responsibility of maintaining that thing. She does tons of work on it even to this day. We have interns that help, but Marilyn does the bulk of the work, because she's up there. And Dave and I aren't,
Well, be sure to thank her for me and everyone else. It is interesting. I don't, a good friend of mine, Adam Gorightly he's written so many books, but he's written stuff related to the Kennedy assassination. Some of, again, the stranger quarters of it with regard to, blanking on the fellow's name, Thornley.
Terry Thornley. Yeah.
But he also wrote a massive book on Charles Manson, The Shadow over Santa Susana, I think was the title. And of course, more recently, there's been this book, I think it's titled Chaos. That's gotten so much attention. And so it's weird. I haven't seen the level of conspiracy criticism leveled at it, which then often may be a tell about something. I'm not accusing here. But that is the kind of thing that often makes me wonder, like what narrative is being allowed, but at the same time, sometimes, sometimes the mainstream's criticism is an attempt to elevate something.
I smiled at that because I seem to be, I've spoken negatively about the book Chaos, very, very briefly on other shows. And I seem to be the only one who sees these problems. I'm glad to see that you also have questions. That the guy who wrote that book is a very good friend of a good friend of mine, and he takes him very seriously. I think my Chaos doesn't, this is not to say that Chaos is a bad book. It has good stuff in it for sure. I did think it was kind of funny that there was all this sort of fanfare about the book when it kind of it goes about 50 yards of what you can get into from Mae Brussel. It's basically Mae Brussel with a few new things, which he did get, and he deserves all the credit in the world for what he found. But almost 90% of that stuff was in Mae Brussel. And if you listen to those shows, Mae is doing this in real time, and that was the most amazing thing about her. So something's happening and she's analyzing it like that, which I cannot do. I have to have a little bit of time to be able to look at everything. But Mae would just bam, 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 bam. I agree with the general premise. I don't necessarily agree with everything that he put into Chaos. But like I said, I have been a little bit reluctant to discuss it. One of these days maybe I'll get into it in a big way. But yeah, I have questions.
I wanted to say, your friend and fellow researcher Richard Bartholomew says, I agree with Joe that modern scientific theories are, of course, models and silly to an extent, but viewers may find my essay, The Real Conspiracy Nuts, of interest at his website, bartholoviews.substack.com. I argue that the difference between ideas like the many worlds interpretation multiverse theory of quantum physics and ideas like a flat earth is in their explanatory power. John Judge said, not all conspiracy theories are equal. The same is true of all theories.
Yeah, absolutely. He likes that stuff more than I do.
As you were telling me.
Yeah. And he's much more, he believes in I don't believe is a tough word, but
right.
He's more of a proponent of the science than I am to a large extent. A couple of years ago, I had a play produced called Einstein's Wrong About Everything. So that's kind of where I stand on that stuff.
And that reminds me, and something I wanted to say when I was bringing up Downard, which I do not bring up Downard because of some reverence for that character. He is despicable is one of the words that comes to mind, and problematic to an extreme. But the issue of you also write fiction, and plays, and also I was also going to comment about Peter Dale Scott, the originator of, I believe, the phrase deep politics. I often say that he's the originator of the word parapolitics, but I think that's incorrect. But
yeah, it's deep politics.
Right.
And Peter would not like the term parapolitics.
Okay. See, thank you for correcting me on that. But he's a poet, and I just always am fascinated when people work in these different modes of words, wordsmithing, and storytelling, and information transfer. You undoubtedly worked some of this into your fiction, I'm assuming.
Oh yeah. No, I tend to play with wilder ideas, and ideas that I don't necessarily espouse, but I explore them in the plays. I had a play a few years ago that came out called The Vapors, and one of the characters in it is a flat earther. And there's a whole scene that I wrote where the flat earther is arguing with the character that's based on Christopher Hitchens, and so they really go at it. But it was funny too, because one of the reviews, I think it was the Broadway, there's a website called Broadway World. They gave it a bad review because I included a flat earther in the play. Like, just the fact that I included somebody.
Wow.
They didn't like that. So now these people are idiots. They should be treated with any respect. And I don't understand that. Like, if you're going to criticize someone, you have to understand what they're actually espousing, and then you can criticize them, which is what I do in the play. But he does say some points that flat earthers try to make. I mean, that's the character. So, but definitely they inform each other. I have there's JFK stuff, and Klondime is over, and I do tend to play with different, wilder theories in those plays.
And I was just reminded recently. So my favorite UFO researcher, everybody knows, is Jacques Vallée, who is an award-winning science fiction writer, and it's not his main area of production, but in his journals and his diaries that he's been gracious enough to share with the world, he in one of them I was rereading where he just talks about he put out a book called Stratagem, where he explicitly in his diary says, this is my chance to play with some of my own speculations, or the things I'm not willing to commit to as fact. And I think that storytelling is so important to humanity. Obviously, it was our first history, and that is how we get across histories. It's interesting with the rise of the internet and videos and memes, and which is seeming in some ways like a de-evolution away from learned intellectual thinking and reading of books. And you were quoting a headline recently, which reminds me of something I also wanted to ask you, which is, did Mae Brussel ever put her stuff into a book? Has anybody ever collected her works?
Yes, I at the very beginning I pointed to it. This is very recent, though. Just a few years ago.
Okay.
Parfrey did that.
Right.
We got it together. But now, and like I say, Krasner was involved, and Alex Constantine was involved. It's really good, and I recommend it to anybody.
Great.
But it was Krasner who first published Mae Brussel in The Realist. Yeah.
Well, I don't have any other questions popping up, but I did really want to thank you so much for taking the time, and everybody, thank you for taking the time in your Saturday night, and really enjoyed the talk, and looking forward to our growing friendship Also, Richard, listening, I need to talk to you. I can't wait to find out more about our areas of interest that overlap. And I had so much to learn from both of you and all of your compatriots in the parapolitical, deep politics scene. I for years co-hosted PSYOP Radio with my good friend Mac White, and he was my JFK expert. And while he might object to the use of the word expert, he'd read so much, and I always could go to him with my questions. And it's been a long time since I've had the chance to sit and chat with him about any of these subjects, but looking forward to more conversations with all of you, and especially with you, Joe. Thank you so much for tonight. And if you'll hang on, we'll talk after we end tonight's lecture. So thank you all. You can find out more about the Anomaly Archives. We are a nonprofit 501c3. We're at anomalyarchives.org. And we could use your help and support. As Joe was saying, with the Hidden History Center, it takes money to preserve this material, to make it accessible. And it's a struggle for small independent nonprofits such as ours. But we persevere, and we'll be doing our usual weekly Wednesday night live Anomaly Now shows. And we're going to have more interviews and special podcast for our Patreon members very soon. So thank you for your support, and have a wonderful night, everyone. Good night.